Arnhem, September 18th, 1944, 0814. A day that began with heavy rain falling on the burning ruins of a Dutch city, a day soaked in the blood and despair of the 2nd Parachute Battalion. While hardened men, forged in the crucible of war, clutched their machine guns and prayed for a miracle, one figure stood apart. Unarmed, unflinching, Major Diggby Tatham-Warter. Not a weapon in his hand, but a cane umbrella. 60 yards away, a monstrous steel beast of the Wehrmacht rounded the corner, its tracks churning the wet asphalt, its machine guns eager for British flesh. The Panzerfausts were empty, the ammunition dwindling. Rifle fire, they knew, would glance off that thick German armor like raindrops off a tin roof. Digby's platoon, trapped, outgunned, frozen in the face of inevitable annihilation, braced for the end. But Diggby did not retreat. He did not seek cover. He did not call for a medic, nor for reinforcements that would never come. Instead, with a calmness that bordered on the surreal, he opened his umbrella. A simple black silk canopy blossoming in the hellish downpour. And then he stepped out from the flimsy protection of the ruins into the naked vulnerability of the street. He began to walk, towards the tank, towards the impossible. His commanding officer had once derided it as the folly of a damn fool. The chaplain, in his solemn piety, had called it an absurdity, a testament to a mind unmoored by the realities of war. But in the next 30 seconds, that fool, armed with nothing but a 14-ounce piece of silk and wood, was about to defy every law of physics, every shred of military doctrine, every ounce of sanity. He was about to perform the impossible. He was about to disable a war machine built for conquest, designed to crush the spirit and flesh of an entire continent. To truly comprehend this audacious act, to grasp the sheer, bewildering audacity of the umbrella, one must first understand the man who carried it. A man who refused to conform, a man who saw the battlefield not just as a place of death, but as a stage for an entirely different kind of warfare. This was not madness. This was Diggby. And his story, against the backdrop of Arnhem's last stand, is a testament to the unpredictable, often illogical, yet utterly profound power of human eccentricity in the face of overwhelming odds. He wasn't just walking towards a tank. He was walking into legend. To understand the sheer magnitude of Major Diggby Tatham-Warter's defiance, one must first grasp the inferno that was Arnhem. For days, this Dutch city had been transformed into a charnel house, a brutal testament to the ferocity of war. Operation Market Garden, Field Marshal Montgomery's audacious gamble to end the war by Christmas, had devolved into a meat grinder, a desperate siege. On September 17, 1944, 35,000 paratroopers had descended from the skies, a vast armada of silk canopies blooming against the European sky. Their mission? To seize a series of vital bridges, a highway into the heart of Nazi Germany. But at Arnhem, the furthest and most critical bridge, the plan had unraveled with terrifying speed. Instead of lightly defended garrisons, the British 1st Airborne Division encountered hardened SS Panzer divisions, units that were supposed to be hundreds of miles away, recovering from the relentless fighting in Normandy. The initial optimism, the grand vision of a swift victory, had evaporated under a hail of German steel. Supplies were critically low, ammunition dwindled with every frantic firefight, food and medical aid were virtually non-existent, and the relentless German counterattacks pushed the beleaguered paratroopers into an ever-tightening perimeter around the Oosterbeek area, miles from their objective, the main road bridge over the Lower Rhine. The air was thick with the stench of burning buildings, cordite, and death. Every street corner was a kill zone, every ruined house a potential ambush. Communications had broken down, isolating pockets of British resistance. The promised ground relief column, XX Corps, was stalled, bogged down by fierce German resistance further south. Hope, a precious commodity, was in desperately short supply. The men of the 2nd Parachute Battalion, Digby's men, were caught in the eye of this storm. They had fought with unimaginable bravery, holding their ground against overwhelming odds. But now, pushed back to the very brink, surrounded, their numbers decimated, their morale frayed, they faced a stark reality. Survival was a luxury, and death a constant companion. It was into this crucible of desperation, against this backdrop of utter ruin and impending defeat, that Diggby Tatham-Warter stepped, not with a roar of defiance, but with the quiet click of an umbrella. His actions, therefore, weren't just brave. They were a singular act of psychological warfare, a bizarre, almost poetic rebellion against the crushing logic of total war. He was an anomaly in the maelstrom, a human challenge to the very concept of military might, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not steel, but audacity.
Who was this man, Diggby Tatham-Warter? To understand the legend, we must first peel back the layers of myth and extraordinary circumstance and look at the foundation upon which he was built. Born in 1917, in an England still reeling from the Great War, but on the cusp of another global conflict, Diggby came from a lineage steeped in tradition and service. Yet, even as a young man, there was an unmistakable spark of the unconventional about him, a quiet defiance of rigid expectations that would ultimately define his military career. His path, like many young men of his class, led to the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, the prestigious institution that forged the officers of the British Army. Sandhurst was not merely a school, it was a crucible designed to temper character, instill discipline, and cultivate leadership. Here, intellect met endurance, and young men were transformed into the leaders who would carry the weight of an empire. Diggby excelled in many areas, displaying the keen mind and physical prowess expected of a future officer. But even within the rigorous confines of Sandhurst, where conformity was paramount and individuality often polished away, Diggby harbored a distinctive spirit. He wasn't overtly rebellious, nor was he a showman. His eccentricity was more subtle, woven into the fabric of his personality, a quiet observation, a wry comment, a peculiar habit. The military, by its very nature, demands uniformity. It thrives on predictability, on systems, on men who can seamlessly fit into a larger, complex machine. Yet, history is often shaped not by the conforming many, but by the unconventional few. It is in the spaces between the rules, in the unexpected deviations from the norm, that true innovation and unforgettable acts of courage are sometimes born. Diggby Tatham-Warter, the Sandhurst-educated officer, was destined to lead. But how he would choose to lead and the tools he would employ in the face of absolute chaos would set him apart from every officer who had ever marched through those hallowed gates. He was being trained for war, but he was also, in his own unique way, preparing for a war that required more than just standard-issue courage. A war that required an umbrella, a bowler hat, and an indomitable will to be undeniably himself. In the high-stakes, life-or-death chaos of airborne warfare, where enemy lines blurred and the night belonged to ghosts, a soldier's identity was his shield, and his password, his very breath. To forget it was not merely an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. And for Major Diggby Tatham-Warter, this was a problem of terrifying personal dimension. His mind, though sharp and strategic, possessed a peculiar quirk, a profound and persistent inability to recall passwords. Imagine the battlefield at night, a labyrinth of shadows and uncertainty. Your unit is dug in, exhausted, alert for the enemy. A figure emerges from the darkness, a blurred shape moving towards your position. Halt, challenge, you bark. The response is expected, a specific word or phrase, prearranged, memorized. But what if the approaching figure is a comrade, a friend, a vital messenger, and he freezes, the password escaping him in the fog of adrenaline and fear? Or worse, what if he is an enemy infiltrator, perfectly mimicking the uniform, but stumbles on the code? In those split seconds, a wrong decision meant a brother-in-arms shot by friendly fire, or a breach in your defenses that could cost dozens of lives. The constant pressure of remembering these ever-changing, arbitrary codes was a psychological burden, a low hum of anxiety beneath the roaring symphony of war. For Diggby, an officer responsible for the lives of his men, this was not a flaw he could simply ignore. It was a ticking bomb within his own mind. He knew the cost of forgetfulness. He had witnessed the tragic consequences of mistaken identity, the instant, irreversible brutality of the battlefield when trust evaporated. He couldn't afford to be the man who jeopardized his unit, or worse, himself, by uttering the wrong word at the wrong time. He needed more than a code. He needed an identifier so distinct, so profoundly undeniable, so uniquely him, that no German infiltrator, no matter how cunning, would ever dare attempt to copy it. It had to be something that screamed British, yet defied every convention of military stealth and practicality. It had to be a statement, a challenge, a declaration of identity that transcended language and combat manuals. The very essence of his survival, and perhaps the survival of those around him, hinged on finding a solution. A solution that, in its very conception, would seem ludicrous, impossible, even insane to the pragmatic minds of military planners. But for Diggby, it was a logical necessity, a brilliant, if utterly bizarre, stroke of genius in the making.
In the crucible of a mind wrestling with a lethal problem, genius often emerges from the most unexpected places. For Diggby Tatham-Warter, the solution for his password predicament wasn't found in a tactical manual or a strategic briefing. It was born from a deeper understanding of identity, culture, and the very human need for distinction. He needed an identifier, not a temporary code prone to erasure by fatigue or fear, but a permanent, undeniable mark. Something so inherently British, so fundamentally civilian, that its presence on a battlefield would be an act of utter defiance. No German infiltrator, no matter how meticulously trained, would ever dare to parade such an item. Imagine the scene. A German commando masquerading as a British officer, attempting to mimic the swagger of a Sandhurst man, but then, in a moment of utter disbelief, being forced to carry an umbrella into battle. The absurdity alone would betray him. The very idea was a stroke of psychological brilliance, a calculated gamble on the cultural dissonance between enemy forces. But why an umbrella? The umbrella was, and remains, an enduring symbol of British eccentricity, resilience, and understated defiance. It speaks of gentlemanly decorum even in a downpour, of a stiff upper lip against the elements. It is the antithesis of a weapon, the antithesis of war. It weighs a mere 14 ounces, a feather-light counterpoint to the 65 pounds of ammunition, grenades, and fighting gear that a standard British paratrooper was expected to carry. Yet in Diggby's hands, it would become an instrument of unexpected power. He paired it with another emblem of classic Britishness, the bowler hat. Together, they formed an unmistakable caricature, a walking, talking assertion of identity that could not be faked. This wasn't merely a practical solution. It was a psychological shield, a statement of unwavering self-possession in a world tearing itself apart. He understood that in the utter chaos of airborne warfare, where uniforms were muddied and faces obscured by grime and fear, men would look for more than rank. They would look for a symbol, a beacon of familiarity, a touchstone of what they were fighting for. The umbrella, in its profound unsuitability for combat, became profoundly suitable. It was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to let the brutal uniformities of war erase the nuances of individual character. It was Diggby saying, "I am here, I am British, and I am myself, even on the brink of hell." The birth of this icon was not a moment of fanfare, but a moment of quiet, audacious conviction, a private, powerful decision that would soon echo across the ruins of Arnhem. The Airfields of England, September 17, 1944. A spectacle of raw power and human ambition. Operation Market Garden, Field Marshal Montgomery's daring gamble to end the war by Christmas, was about to be unleashed. Thousands upon thousands of paratroopers, the elite of the Allied forces, converged on the staging areas, a living tide of young men, each carrying the weight of expectation and the physical burden of war. The atmosphere was electric, thick with the scent of aviation fuel, anticipation, and the quiet dread of the unknown. Squadron after squadron of C-47 transport planes stretched for miles, their mighty engines humming with a restless energy, ready to carry their precious cargo into the heart of occupied Europe. Each man was a walking arsenal, a mobile fighting unit, meticulously packed with the tools of his trade. 65 pounds. That was the average weight of a British paratrooper's kit. Rifles, ammunition, grenades, radios, emergency rations, medical supplies, all strapped and buckled, designed for survival and combat far behind enemy lines. Every ounce was carefully considered, every item chosen for its crucial utility. In such a high-stakes endeavor, there was no room for superfluity, no tolerance for anything that did not directly contribute to the mission's success or the soldier's survival. Yet, amidst this meticulously planned display of military might, one officer stood in stark, almost comical contrast: Major Diggby Tatham-Warter. His comrades, burdened by their essential gear, watched as Diggby, with an almost impudent nonchalance, packed not just his rifle and essential kit, but also a pristine bowler hat and, of course, his cane umbrella. A symbol of civilian life, a relic of a bygone era, nestled amongst the instruments of destruction. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a profound statement that defied every military convention, every logical impulse. The rising sun, piercing through the morning mist, illuminated not just the vast airborne armada, but also the subtle tension, the unvoiced questions, the palpable disbelief in the eyes of those who witnessed Diggby's peculiar preparations. For many, it was an inexplicable folly, an act of performative eccentricity that seemed utterly misplaced on the eve of one of the largest airborne operations in history. But for Diggby, it was an essential part of his combat kit, a non-negotiable component of his identity. He was not just preparing for battle, he was preparing for a very specific kind of battle, one where the unexpected, the symbolic, and the utterly human would play a role as vital as any bullet or bayonet. The stage was set, the engines roared, and the world held its breath. Market Garden's dawn was not just the beginning of an operation, it was the prelude to a legend. The military, by its very nature, is a culture of conformity. Uniformity is not just about appearance, it's about cohesion, about a shared identity, about a collective purpose. An outlier, particularly one who challenges established norms in such a visible and seemingly frivolous way, inevitably becomes a target. And so it was for Major Diggby Tatham-Warter and his faithful umbrella. The mockery was instant, a wave of incredulous amusement that rippled through the mess halls and barracks of the staging area. For 6 weeks leading up to the invasion, the umbrella became the punchline, the enduring jest of the mess. Diggby's toy, they called it, with a dismissive chuckle. The dandy of the airborne, they whispered, often within earshot. One young lieutenant, brimming with youthful bravado and a touch of condescension, approached Diggby with a smirk, jesting, "Major, do you plan to have tea with the Germans when you land? Perhaps a spot of crumpets?" Diggby, ever composed, met the sarcasm with an almost paternal calm, his gaze unwavering. Even the battalion commander, a man of legendary grit and an officer who would carve his own indelible mark in the annals of airborne history, couldn't resist a direct challenge. He eyed the offending accessory with a mixture of bewilderment and irritation. "Tatham-Warter," he boomed, his voice carrying the weight of rank and expectation, "is that contraption standard issue, pray tell?" Diggby, without a flicker of hesitation, simply replied, his tone as smooth and unruffled as the silk of his canopy, "My goodness, sir, what if it rains?" The response, so disarmingly simple, so utterly British in its understated irony, left the commander momentarily speechless. The easy laughter that followed, however, was laced with judgment. They saw a man out of step, an eccentric indulging a bizarre whim on the precipice of war. They saw a symbol of absurdity where Diggby saw a symbol of survival. This wasn't just lighthearted banter, it was a subtle form of social pressure, a military gauntlet thrown down. To be singled out, to be the subject of constant jokes, could erode the strongest will. Yet Diggby stood firm, his conviction unshaken.
He understood that ridicule often stems from a failure of imagination, a reluctance to see beyond the obvious. While they laughed, Diggby was seeing a different battlefield, a psychological landscape where the conventional rules would cease to apply, and where a piece of silk and wood might, in fact, be the most potent weapon of all. He was, in their eyes, a misfit. But for Diggby, being a misfit was precisely the point. It was his strength. It was his signature. And soon, the world would learn why.
While the jests and japes about his toy continued, Diggby Tatham-Warter harbored a profound and almost prophetic understanding that eluded his peers. He knew something they didn't. He knew that when the sky filled with the ghostly parachutes of an airborne assault, and the ground erupted in the terrifying symphony of mortar fire, machine guns, and human screams, sanity would vanish. The meticulous order of military hierarchy, the clear distinctions of rank and uniform, the precise protocols of challenge and response, all of it, he surmised, would be swallowed by the maelstrom of confusion. In that blinding, deafening chaos, men wouldn't have the luxury of scrutinizing a shoulder flash or memorizing an ever-changing password. Their minds, battered by fear, exhaustion, and the primal urge for survival, would simplify. They would seek not detail, but essence. They would look for a symbol. Diggby understood human psychology under duress. He knew that in moments of extreme peril, the brain defaults to pattern recognition, to archetypes, to something instantly recognizable. A uniform, no matter how distinctive, could be muddied, torn, or copied. A password could be forgotten or misheard. But an officer calmly striding through a hellscape with a bowler hat and an open umbrella, that was not merely an image, it was an indelible statement. It was a beacon of the utterly improbable, and therefore undeniably authentic. This was not a fool's errand. It was a stroke of profound strategic genius, a form of psychological warfare against both friend and foe. To his own men, it would be a rallying point, a familiar, almost absurdly comforting sight that cut through the terror, reminding them of home, of British defiance, of an unyielding spirit. To the Germans, it would be an incomprehensible, bewildering sight, a figure so utterly out of place that it would sow doubt and confusion. He understood that the most effective disguise is not blending in, but standing out in such an outrageous way that suspicion gives way to baffled disbelief. He was creating a signature, an unforgeable emblem of his very being. The umbrella was more than just a personal identifier. It was a statement of intent, a declaration of a mind that refused to be broken by the grim realities of war. It was an act of faith, not in conventional weaponry, but in the power of the human spirit to assert its individuality, even in the face of annihilation. Diggby Tatham-Warter was not just preparing for a battle, he was preparing for a psychological triumph, where the calmest man in the hurricane, armed with the most unlikely of tools, would become the unforgettable symbol of courage against impossible odds. He foresaw the chaos, and he armed himself not with more steel, but with a silk canopy and an indomitable will. September 17, 1944. The sky over Holland erupted into a spectacle of audacious hope. Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne assault in history, was underway. Thousands of Allied paratroopers, a vast aerial armada of silk and steel, descended from the heavens, a strategic spearhead aimed at the heart of the Third Reich. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. From the cramped interiors of the C-47 transport planes, young men, hardened by training yet acutely aware of the mortal risks, peered out at the vast expanse below. Their hearts pounded with a mixture of adrenaline and apprehension. This was it, the moment they had trained for, the gamble that promised to end the war by Christmas. Then the green light. A deafening roar of wind, a leap into the void, and the sudden exhilarating jerk as the parachute deployed, transforming the soldier into a fleeting, vulnerable blossom drifting towards enemy territory. The air was filled with 1,000 silent prayers and the steady hum of descending silk. On the ground, the picturesque Dutch landscape, soon to be scarred by the brutal reality of combat, awaited. Farmers looked up in stunned disbelief as their peaceful fields became landing zones, their ancient trees suddenly festooned with tangled canopies. The initial landings were, for many, a testament to careful planning, swift, decisive, and relatively uncontested in the primary drop zones. But this was merely the calm before the storm. The immediate objective for Digby's 1st British Airborne Division was the bridge at Arnhem, the furthest and most critical objective. The initial reports from intelligence suggested light resistance, perhaps a few elderly German garrisons. The reality, however, was a cruel twist of fate. Unknown to Allied command, elite SS Panzer divisions were recuperating in the very areas the paratroopers were dropping. The pleasant autumn day quickly dissolved into a nightmare. The sounds of birdsong gave way to the rattle of machine guns. The gentle rustle of leaves was replaced by the terrifying shriek of incoming mortar fire. As paratroopers gathered their bearings, untangled their lines, and oriented themselves on the Dutch soil, they began to encounter the fierce, unyielding resistance that would define Arnhem. The gamble had begun, but the odds, already astronomical, were rapidly shortening. And amidst this burgeoning chaos, as men grappled with the brutal surprise of a well-entrenched and determined enemy, the extraordinary figure of Major Diggby Tatham-Warter, his bowler hat firmly in place, his umbrella tucked under his arm, was about to step onto a battlefield where only the truly unconventional could hope to leave a mark. The die was cast, and the fight for Arnhem was about to descend into a legend of human endurance and audacious defiance. The initial landings of Operation Market Garden might have promised a swift victory, but the reality that unfolded in Arnhem was a brutal, unforgiving nightmare. What was intended as a rapid capture of a vital crossing became a desperate, protracted siege, a battle for survival against overwhelming odds. The target? Arnhem Bridge, a strategic artery over the Lower Rhine, crucial for the Allied advance. But the path to it was paved with blood and steel. Almost immediately, the British 1st Airborne Division, particularly Digby's 2nd Parachute Battalion, encountered ferocious, unexpected resistance. Instead of the weary, disorganized troops anticipated, they faced battle-hardened elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, units fully equipped and determined to hold their ground. The streets of Arnhem transformed into a hellish labyrinth of urban warfare. Every building, every alleyway became a contested stronghold. German snipers picked off men from hidden positions, while machine gun nests spat out ceaseless streams of lead. But the true terror came in the form of German armor. Tanks, formidable and seemingly impervious, rumbled through the narrow streets, spitting fire and flattening defenses. The British paratroopers, lightly armed for a swift assault, found themselves woefully outmatched against this mechanized might. Their Piat anti-tank weapons were few, often ineffective against the thick frontal armor, and their ammunition reserves dwindled with every desperate firefight. Communications were shattered, severing vital links to command and neighboring units. Supplies, dropped from the air, often fell into German hands or were too dangerous to retrieve under constant fire. Food and water became luxuries, replaced by hunger and thirst. The dream of a swift end to the war was replaced by the stark reality of encirclement. For days, the men fought with unimaginable courage, often outnumbered 10-1. They held their ground in burning buildings, fashioned makeshift barricades from rubble, and launched desperate counterattacks. But the pressure was relentless, suffocating. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the devastated city. Hope, a flickering candle in a hurricane, threatened to be extinguished entirely. By the morning of September 18th, as heavy rain began to fall on the burning ruins, the situation was beyond critical. The 2nd Parachute Battalion, having fought their way to the northern end of the bridge, were now isolated, surrounded, and facing a relentless German onslaught. They were trapped, their escape routes cut, their ammunition almost exhausted. It was in this moment of utter desolation, on the precipice of total defeat, that Major Diggby Tatham-Warter, a man who had brought an umbrella to war, found himself at the epicenter of the storm.
His platoon, outgunned and outmaneuvered, was about to be overrun. But Diggby, with an act that defied every military logic and every human instinct for self-preservation, was about to write a new, astonishing chapter in the bloody annals of Arnhem.
At 8:14, September 18, 1944, the world stopped for Diggby Tatham-Warter's platoon. A German armored vehicle, a hulking metallic predator, turned the corner, its cannon and machine guns spewing death, its armor shrugging off rifle fire like rain. The men were trapped, pinned down, staring into the face of certain annihilation. Then, Diggby, a figure of almost serene defiance. He did not raise a rifle. He did not shout orders. He simply opened his umbrella. A black silk canopy, stark against the gray, rain-swept ruins. And he began to walk towards the tank. This wasn't a charge of reckless abandon. It was a measured, deliberate advance, each step a testament to an unyielding will. The German tank commander, peering through his periscope, or perhaps from an open hatch, must have been utterly bewildered. What was this? A lone man, unarmed, strolling towards his war machine with a gentleman's accessory? The absurdity of the sight, so utterly alien to the brutal logic of war, caused a momentary but critical hesitation. The machine guns, previously blazing, fell silent. The heavy tracks, which had been grinding menacingly, slowed. The German crew, trained to identify threats, to engage targets, found their protocols shattered by the inexplicable. Their minds, accustomed to the expected patterns of combat, struggled to process this bizarre anomaly. It was a psychological shockwave, a momentary paralysis born of utter confusion. It was in this sliver of bewilderment, this fleeting instant of cognitive dissonance, that Diggby's audacious gamble paid off. As the tank crew wrestled with the surreal vision before them, their attention diverted by the sheer, unadulterated oddity of the umbrella-wielding Englishman, a window of opportunity, however tiny, was violently forced open. Perhaps the tank swerved, momentarily exposing a vulnerable flank. Perhaps the crew, distracted by the spectacle, failed to see another desperate British soldier, previously hidden amongst the rebel, emerge from cover with a PIT, the British Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. In the chaotic maelstrom of Arnhem, historical accounts suggest that Digby's extraordinary act of distraction created the precise conditions for a decisive blow. While the umbrella itself may not have physically disabled the tank, it achieved something far more potent. It disabled the enemy's mind. It broke their focus. It shattered their expectation. And in war, a moment of confusion can be as deadly as any bullet. The PIT roared, a crude but powerful explosion of shaped charge, striking the armor. The monstrous war machine shuddered, then ground to a halt, smoke beginning to billow from its crippled engine. The impossible, through an act of sheer, unbelievable audacity, had just unfolded. Diggby Tatham-Warter, the dandy of the airborne, had just used a 14-ounce piece of silk and wood to disable a war machine built to conquer Europe. It was a testament not to brute force, but to the unpredictable, often illogical, yet utterly profound power of human eccentricity and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. A true miracle, born from a cane umbrella. The disablement of the German armored vehicle was not the end of Diggby Tatham-Warter's story in Arnhem. It was merely another extraordinary chapter in a saga of unwavering courage. His umbrella, now a silent witness to an unfolding miracle, continued to be his distinctive mark throughout the brutal days that followed. As the situation for the 1st Airborne Division grew increasingly dire, Diggby remained a beacon of unflappable resolve. He was seen dashing through intense fire, his umbrella occasionally unfurled, to rescue a chaplain under heavy German shelling, escorting him to safety. He rallied exhausted, demoralized men, his calm demeanor and absurd accessory somehow injecting a renewed sense of defiance into their weary souls. His acts of bravery extended beyond the battlefield. When his men were trapped in a Dutch house surrounded by German troops, Diggby, with characteristic audacity, orchestrated a daring escape. He led them through enemy lines, even disguising himself in civilian clothes, mingling with Dutch civilians, using his quick wit and remarkable composure to evade capture. He was even known to have, at one point, ridden a bicycle to reconnoiter enemy positions, his umbrella still very much a part of his unconventional arsenal. The battle for Arnhem ultimately ended in a heroic but tragic defeat for the Allies. The bridge could not be held, and thousands of British paratroopers were either killed, wounded, or captured. But Diggby Tatham-Warter, against all odds, managed to escape the encirclement, crossing the Rhine with a small group of his men, a testament to his resourcefulness and indomitable spirit. After the war, Diggby continued to serve, but his legend, forged in the fires of Arnhem, preceded him. He became known as the Man with the Umbrella, a symbol of a uniquely British blend of eccentricity, stoicism, and raw courage. His story resonated because it spoke to a truth often forgotten in the grim calculus of war, that sometimes the most profound acts of bravery are not those of brute force, but of defiant individuality, of refusing to let the dehumanizing machinery of conflict strip away one's essential character. The umbrella, that innocuous 14-ounce piece of silk and wood, became more than a personal identifier. It became an emblem of hope, a tangible representation that even in the darkest moments, against the most formidable of foes, a single act of audacious, unconventional courage can alter the course of events, inspire others, and etch itself into the annals of history. Diggby Tatham-Warter, the dandy of the airborne, proved that a gentleman's accessory, wielded with unwavering conviction, could indeed disable a war machine, not just through physical means, but by breaking the very spirit of the enemy and uplifting the hearts of his comrades. His legacy is a timeless reminder that true strength often lies not in conforming, but in daring to be uniquely, audaciously, and impossibly oneself.